Just after midnight on Saturday, the President of the United States posted a message online accusing Canada of wanting the benefits of being an American state without actually being one. Hours earlier, Canada's Prime Minister had walked out of the negotiating room entirely, called off his own negotiators, and let a 50% tariff on nearly $30 billion of Canadian goods take effect rather than sign what was put in front of him. Then he stood in front of cameras and used a word no Canadian Prime Minister has used about the United States in living memory. He said, "Canada is at war, not a trade dispute, not a rough patch in negotiations. War. This is the moment the entire 18-month standoff between Washington and Ottawa finally snapped, and it happened in the span of about 72 hours, faster and more dramatically than almost anyone watching this fight expected. 4 days ago, Trump was publicly celebrating a done deal. Right now, both countries are firing tariffs at each other with no negotiating table in sight. And the reason why is a story most coverage is still only telling half of. Stick with this, because what actually caused this collapse says something much bigger about where this relationship is headed. And hit subscribe if you want to keep tracking this in real time, because this is moving fast and it is far from finished. Now let's go back just a few days, because the whiplash here is almost impossible to overstate. And understanding it requires walking through exactly what happened in order. On July 20th, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a 96-year-old statute that had not been used to impose a tariff since 1949. The proclamations targeted Canadian motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy products, each carrying an additional 50% duty, together covering somewhere between $20 and $28 billion of Canadian goods, depending on which government's own figures you use. The White House framed all 3 actions as a response to Canadian discrimination against American businesses, specifically the provincial bans on American alcohol, Canada's own auto surtax, and long-running disputes over dairy import quotas. The tariffs were set to take effect 30 days later, at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th. As that deadline approached, both governments appeared to be moving toward resolution. Canada's trade minister and its chief negotiator spent the better part of 2 weeks in Washington. Carney and Trump spoke by phone multiple times in the final days. And less than 2 hours before the tariffs were scheduled to hit, Trump posted on social media that the 2 countries, subject to finalizing paperwork, had reached a deal, adding an exclamation point for emphasis. He paused the tariffs for 3 days. Carney's own statement at the time was noticeably more careful, describing substantial progress while stressing that important work remained. That gap in tone, one side already celebrating, the other side hedging, turned out to be the single biggest tell in this entire story, and almost nobody caught it in the moment. Over the following 3 days, negotiators kept talking. Canada's trade minister met with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer for several hours on Thursday. By all accounts from both sides, real progress was being made on the core economic terms. Canada had offered to remove its remaining retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and autos, tariffs that had been sitting in place since the original round of this fight back in 2025. Ottawa had also agreed to push its provinces to finally lift the alcohol bans that had kept American beer, wine, and spirits off Canadian liquor store shelves for a year and a half. A boycott so effective it had contributed to double-digit sales declines at companies like Brown-Forman and Diageo throughout that entire period. In exchange, Washington had offered to substantially cut its tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and softwood lumber, along with cooperation on aerospace supply chains, critical minerals, and enforcement against goods made with forced labor. On paper, that trade looked close to done. Then, according to Carney's own account, in the final hours before the deal was supposed to be finalized, American negotiators introduced 3 new demands that had not been part of the agreement both sides believed they'd reached earlier in the week. This is your first real pause point in this story, and it's worth sitting with, because these 3 demands are the actual reason everything fell apart, and almost none of the initial headlines explained them clearly. The first demand involved automobiles specifically. Carney said American negotiators tried to narrow the scope of the auto tariff relief at the very last minute, attempting to exclude medium and heavy-duty trucks from the agreement entirely, a category that matters enormously to Canadian manufacturing. Canada had understood, based on days of prior talks, that the tariff relief would cover the full range of vehicles moving across the border. Suddenly, in the closing hours, the Americans wanted to limit it to passenger autos only, according to Carney's own description of the exchange. The second demand was the one Carney described as the most alarming, because it had almost nothing to do with tariffs at all. He said the United States tried to insert language restricting Canada's ability to negotiate trade agreements with other countries entirely, essentially asking Ottawa to align significant portions of its own independent trade policy with Washington's preferences before pursuing new partnerships elsewhere in the world. Carney called this a matter of national sovereignty, full stop, and pointed to the more than 20 new trade and economic partnerships Canada has signed over the past year and a half, deals with Ecuador, the United Arab Emirates, an expanded relationship with the European Union, a preliminary agreement with China, ongoing talks with countries across South America and Southeast Asia, as evidence of exactly the kind of independent economic diversification strategy Canada was not willing to put on the table as a bargaining chip. The third demand touched something even more sensitive inside Canadian politics: protections for Canadian culture and the French language. According to Canada's own ambassador to the United States, the specific dispute involves subsidies supporting French language culture, requirements around the prevalence of French language media online, and rules requiring foreign streaming services operating in Canada to make a certain amount of Canadian content discoverable to users, provisions written into Canada's Online Streaming Act. Washington, representing American streaming and media companies operating in the Canadian market, wanted those protections weakened or removed as part of the broader deal. Carney was unambiguous in his public remarks. He said Canada had faced continual efforts to restrict its protections of its language, its culture, and, in his words, in effect, its sovereignty, and that those efforts had always been resisted and always would be. Put those three demands together, and you can see exactly why Carney walked. It is one thing to negotiate steel tariffs and dairy quotas, the ordinary grinding stuff of trade policy that every government accepts as part of doing business with a neighbor. It is an entirely different thing to be asked, in the final hours of a negotiation, to accept restrictions on which countries you're allowed to trade with, and to weaken legal protections for your own national language and culture. Carney told reporters that, taken together, these last-minute additions revealed something deeper than a simple disagreement over terms. He said they showed that the United States was not actually interested in what he called a true economic partnership with Canada at all. Here's your second rehook. Because Carney's language when he announced the collapse was unusually pointed for a man whose entire professional reputation has been built on measured central banker restraint. He told reporters that the United States, in his words, sometimes signs trade deals in pencil rather than in pen, a clear reference to the pattern of the U.S. reopening or reinterpreting agreements after they'd seemingly been finalized. He contrasted that with what he described as a united Canadian government working together throughout this entire process, implying, without quite saying it outright, that the same unity and reliability did not exist on the other side of the table. That is about as sharp a rebuke as you will hear from a sitting prime minister describing ongoing negotiations with the United States, and it landed exactly as intended. If you're finding this useful, drop a comment telling me which of those three demands you think actually killed the deal: the truck exclusion, the sovereignty restriction, or the culture and language provisions. Because reasonable people watching this closely disagree on which one mattered most. And go ahead and subscribe, because Canada's retaliatory tariffs are scheduled to formally take effect on September 8th, and there's a real chance this entire situation shifts again before that date even arrives. Washington's version of events, predictably, tells a different story. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer posted publicly that Canada had declined to finalize the trade deal under terms he said had already been agreed to earlier in the week. He argued that Washington had offered Canada what he called the best treatment of any major exporter to the American market, and that new demands and walkbacks of commitments from the Canadian side, not the American side, had upended what he described as a careful balance reached over the preceding days. In Greer's telling, it was Canada that moved the goalposts, not Washington. Trump's own overnight social media post went further and got personal, accusing Canada of wanting the benefits of being an American state without being one, and referencing what he called massive tariffs. Canadian farmers had allegedly charged American producers for years. Without the actual draft negotiating text being published by either side, there is genuinely no way to fully verify which account is more accurate. And that ambiguity itself matters, because it means both governments are now operating from two fundamentally different stories about what just happened, with no shared factual foundation to rebuild trust from before the next round of talks, whenever that comes. What is not in dispute is what happened next, because the consequences are already showing up in trade data and public policy on both sides of the border. At 1 minute past midnight on Saturday, the 50% tariffs took effect exactly as originally scheduled back in July, hitting close to $20 billion of Canadian goods, or roughly $27 to $28 billion, depending on the specific accounting used by each government, covering dairy products, alcoholic beverages, cement, and hockey equipment, among the hundreds of tariff lines caught in the proclamation's annexes. Crucially, some of the goods now facing this 50% duty had previously qualified for preferential treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, meaning the shield that trade deal was supposed to provide no longer applies to a meaningful share of Canadian exports heading south. Carney responded within hours, announcing that Canada would match those tariffs dollar for dollar, with the retaliatory measures formally taking effect on September 8th. That gives roughly 2 weeks of buffer before Canada's own countermeasures land, a window that some analysts read as leaving just enough room for either side to reopen talks before the retaliation becomes irreversible, and others read as simply the minimum administrative time Ottawa needs to finalize which specific American products will be targeted. At the same press conference where he announced the retaliation, Carney used the language that has generated the most attention out of this entire saga. Asked to characterize the state of the relationship, he said plainly that you're at war when you get attacked, and that Canada had been attacked. It's worth pausing on how unusual that framing is. This is a country whose entire modern economic identity has been built around the assumption of a stable, predictable, deeply integrated relationship with its southern neighbor, a relationship that survived world wars, the Cold War, and multiple recessions without ever fracturing at this level. Hearing its own prime minister describe the current moment using the language of open conflict, even in an economic sense, is a genuinely significant marker of how far this relationship has traveled in 18 months. Carney followed his public remarks with a longer, more reflective statement published 2 days later, where he laid out his broader thinking for Canadians directly. He said that for much of the country's history, Canadians had been able to count on favorable trade winds, a stable relationship with the United States, increasingly open access to the American market, and rules that both countries understood and respected. Those winds, he said, haven't simply changed direction. The weather itself has changed, and Canada cannot control the storm blowing in from Washington. He described the new American tariffs as a miscalculation, one that will fail because Canadians, in his words, will always take care of each other, pointing to 18 months of what he called small acts of solidarity, choosing Canadian products, vacationing domestically, repeated millions of times. That together sent a message he believes Washington has consistently underestimated. Alongside that message, Carney's government announced roughly $25 billion in new support, specifically aimed at protecting Canadian workers and businesses hurt by the American tariffs, with particular emphasis on small and medium-sized companies that lack the balance sheets. Larger corporations have to simply absorb a sudden 50% cost increase on their American-bound exports. He also signaled that this fall's federal budget will go further, specifically framing new spending and policy as an effort to make Canada more competitive and more attractive to businesses and strategic investors looking to build and grow inside the country, rather than depend on American market access. There's a piece of history worth pulling in here because it explains why Carney's use of the word war landed with as much weight as it did among people who follow this relationship closely. This is a man whose entire professional identity was built on decades of careful, deliberate, almost clinically restrained public language. He holds an economics degree from Harvard and a doctorate from Oxford. He spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs before entering public service. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and later became governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British person in that institution's 300-year history to hold the role, steering the United Kingdom through Brexit and the opening shock of the pandemic. Central bankers, as a professional class, are trained to avoid exactly the kind of dramatic, emotionally charged language Carney used this weekend, because our markets react violently to loose talk from anyone who has spent a career being the calm voice in the room during a crisis. When a person with that specific resume chooses the word war deliberately in a formal press conference, it is not an off-the-cuff outburst. It is a calculated signal aimed simultaneously at Washington, at Canadian voters, and at global markets watching to see how seriously to take this breakdown. That calculation becomes clearer when you look at what Carney did immediately after using that word, because he didn't simply vent and walk away from the podium. He pivoted directly into policy, announcing the $25 billion support package for Canadian workers and businesses within the same set of remarks, and explicitly tying this moment to the broader diversification strategy his government has been executing since the trade war first began back in early 2025. That sequencing matters. He named the crisis in the starkest possible terms, and then immediately followed it with a demonstration that Canada has both a financial cushion and an alternative trade strategy already built and running, rather than leaving Canadians with only the alarming headline and no sense of what comes next. Let's talk about the numbers underneath all of this rhetoric, because the economic stakes here are genuinely enormous regardless of how the politics eventually shake out. The tariffs, now in effect, cover somewhere between $20 and $28 billion of Canadian exports annually, a range that itself reflects the confusion between the two governments' own competing figures. Layer that 50% duty on top of existing Section 232 tariffs already sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and copper, and certain covered products now face a cumulative tariff burden exceeding 75% when crossing into the United States. Canada's own retaliatory measures, set to activate September 8th, are structured as a dollar-for-dollar match, meaning American exporters should expect a mirror image set of tariffs hitting a comparable dollar value of goods heading north on top of whatever remaining retaliatory measures from the earlier 2025 round of this fight are still technically in place. Here's a number worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to lose inside all the political theater. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export market. That fact hasn't changed because talks collapsed. Every governor and senator representing those states now has to explain to their own constituents why a trade relationship that has quietly underpinned huge portions of their local economies for decades just took a dramatic step backward, with no clear resolution timeline attached. Integrated supply chains in the auto sector, where parts routinely cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times before a finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership, don't unwind or rewire themselves overnight just because negotiators walked away from a table in Washington. The costs of this breakdown will show up in real dollar terms on both sides of the border, regardless of which government ultimately gets more public sympathy for how the talks collapsed. Let's put four things side by side because together they capture just how quickly the situation reversed itself and how much uncertainty now sits on top of an already exhausted 18-month standoff. First, 4 days before this collapse, the sitting president of the United States was publicly declaring a completed deal with an exclamation point live on social media. Second, the actual sticking points that ended everything weren't really about tariff percentages or dollar figures at all in the end. They were about sovereignty, about which countries Canada is allowed to negotiate with, and about protections for language and culture that go to the core of how Canada defines itself as a country distinct from the United States. Third, the retaliation Canada has now promised isn't scheduled to take effect for roughly 2 weeks, a gap that leaves open, even if just barely, the possibility of a last-minute reversal before September 8th arrives. Fourth, and this may be the detail that matters most for anyone trying to predict what happens next, Carney explicitly tied this breakdown to Canada's broader diversification strategy, the more than 20 new international partnerships his government has signed since this trade war began, framing the American collapse not as a crisis Canada has no answer for, but as validation of a strategy already well underway before this particular negotiation ever failed. There's also a domestic political dimension to this collapse that deserves real attention because Carney is not just managing a negotiation with Washington. He is managing an increasingly assertive set of provincial premiers who have their own strong opinions about how far Ottawa should bend. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has spent much of the past year publicly pushing for a harder, more immediate, dollar-for-dollar response rather than the kind of patient, carefully sequenced diplomacy Carney's government had been pursuing up until this weekend. A recent poll found that a clear majority of Canadians support some form of retaliatory tariffs, with a meaningful share wanting a full matching response rather than a negotiated climb down. Carney's decision to walk away from the table and immediately announce a dollar-for-dollar retaliation lands as a direct answer to that domestic pressure. And it's worth noting that the political risk of appearing too accommodating toward Washington had been building inside Canada for months before this particular negotiation ever collapsed. In that sense, this weekend's breakdown may have resolved an internal political tension for Carney almost as much as it deepened an external one with Trump. The provincial alcohol boycotts sit at an interesting crossroads inside this exact dynamic, and they're worth returning to briefly here, because they were one of the concessions Canada had actually agreed to make before talks fell apart. Ottawa had pledged to encourage every province to finally lift the retail bans on American beer, wine, and spirits that had been in place since March of 2025. Bans that had contributed to an 81% collapse in Canadian imports of American alcohol and sustained 60+% quarterly sales declines at companies like Brown-Forman. With the broader deal now dead, it remains genuinely unclear whether provinces will still move forward with restocking American products on their own, absent the larger agreement that was supposed to accompany that gesture, or whether this specific concession simply evaporates along with everything else that was on the table this week. Early signals from several premiers suggest at least some willingness to keep that particular door open regardless of the broader collapse, since the boycott was always understood domestically as leverage rather than a permanent policy. But nothing about that piece of the puzzle is settled as of right now. There's one more angle worth examining before we get to where this actually leaves both countries, because it speaks to just how differently the two governments seem to be thinking about the very purpose of this negotiation. Washington's public framing throughout this entire dispute has consistently centered on bilateral trade balances, specific industries like autos and dairy, and the argument that Canada has been treating American businesses unfairly. Carney's framing, especially in his more reflective remarks following the collapse, kept returning again and again to a different register entirely. Sovereignty, identity, the ability of a country to set its own foreign and cultural policy without a larger neighbor dictating the terms. Those are not the same conversation. One side has been negotiating primarily over dollars and tariff schedules. The other side, at least by the end, was negotiating over something closer to national self-definition. When two governments walk into the same room believing they're having fundamentally different conversations, a collapse like this one becomes considerably more likely and considerably harder to simply patch back together with a revised tariff number. That gap in framing also helps explain why this particular breakdown feels different from the several near misses that came before it over the past 18 months. Earlier rounds of this standoff, going back to February 2025, largely revolved around tariff percentages, specific product categories, and timelines, the kind of technical negotiable terrain where both sides could plausibly find a workable middle ground, given enough time and pressure. Sovereignty and cultural protection are not typically the kind of terrain either government treats as negotiable in the same way, which is part of why Carney described his position on those specific points as something that has always been resisted and always will be. Language that leaves considerably less room for a future compromise than anything either side said about steel tariffs or dairy quotas throughout the earlier stages of this fight. Now here's the honest complication in all of this, because a fair read of where this leaves both countries has to hold multiple things together at once. A 90% share of Canadian exports still flows to the United States. Canada's own government has repeatedly acknowledged that geography and decades of integrated supply chains mean genuine full diversification away from the American market remains, at best, a multi-decade project, not something 20 new trade agreements alone can substitute for in the near term. One former Canadian trade official put it bluntly in recent commentary, describing Canada as, in essence, a victim of geography, with genuinely limited near-term options no matter how many deals Ottawa signs with Ecuador or the UAE or anyone else. At the same time, Washington's own side of this equation carries real costs too. 13 million American jobs have been estimated by business groups to be tied to trade with Canada and Mexico combined. And every additional week, this standoff continues. Without resolution adds pressure from American manufacturers, home builders, and food producers who depend on Canadian inputs they cannot easily or quickly replace. There's also a legal dimension hanging over the entire American side of this dispute that rarely gets enough attention in the day-to-day drama. Section 338, the 96-year-old statute underpinning these tariffs, has never been meaningfully tested in modern American courts. Multiple legal scholars argue it was effectively superseded by trade legislation passed in 1962 and 1974, statutes that created far more procedurally rigorous frameworks for exactly this kind of dispute. Canada has already signaled it intends to pursue legal challenges against these tariffs, both domestically in American courts and through World Trade Organization dispute mechanisms, where Canada has a real track record of success, having previously won binding findings against the United States over dairy trade practices in years past. If a court eventually agrees that Section 338 was functionally retired by more recent legislation, the same way the Supreme Court struck down Trump's earlier IEEPA-based tariffs back in February, these 50% duties could be suspended or invalidated entirely, regardless of how this current standoff resolves politically. There's also a piece of this that ordinary Canadian and American consumers are going to feel directly, and it deserves mention before we close this out, because trade collapses like this one rarely stay contained to boardrooms and press conferences for long. Canadian dairy prices, already a politically sensitive category throughout this entire dispute, sit exposed on both sides of the reopened tariff line. American home builders, who depend heavily on Canadian lumber and cement for affordable residential construction, are now back to facing the exact 50% cost increase that industry groups spent the past month warning lawmakers about. And the hospitality and retail sectors on both sides of the border, still adjusting to 18 months of stop-and-start tariff whiplash, now have to plan for yet another round of uncertainty with no clear end date attached. None of that shows up in a single dramatic headline the way Carney's word choice did this weekend, but it is where the actual lasting cost of this breakdown will ultimately be measured, in grocery bills, construction costs, and small business margins on both sides of a border that, until 18 months ago, most people on either side rarely thought about at all. Canada's own legal challenges against Section 338, both through American courts and through World Trade Organization dispute mechanisms, are expected to move forward regardless of whether political negotiations resume in the meantime. That means this standoff is now running on at least 3 separate tracks simultaneously. A political track where both governments may or may not find their way back to a negotiating table, an economic track where Canada's dollar-for-dollar retaliation and the underlying American tariffs continue doing real damage on both sides of the border with each passing week, and a legal track that could, months from now, invalidate the entire American tariff structure, regardless of what either government decides to do politically before then. Any one of those 3 tracks resolving first could reshape the entire situation in ways the other 2 cannot fully predict or control, which is part of why so many analysts watching this closely are reluctant to forecast a clean, single outcome from here. So here's the complete picture as of right now. In the immediate aftermath of one of the most dramatic reversals this entire trade relationship has seen in 18 months of near constant tension. 4 days ago, both governments were describing themselves as close to a finished deal. Then, in the final hours, Washington introduced demands touching auto tariff scope, Canada's independent trade policy, and protections for Canadian language and culture. Demands, Carney says, went well beyond the economic terms both sides believed they'd already agreed to. Rather than accept them, Carney pulled his negotiators out of the room entirely, let the 50% tariffs take effect exactly as scheduled, and promised a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory response landing in roughly 2 weeks. He then stood in front of Canadians and used the word war to describe where this relationship currently stands, a level of rhetorical escalation that has no real precedent in the modern history of this bilateral relationship. Whether this is truly the moment the Canada-U.S. trade relationship pivots into a fundamentally different, more adversarial era, or whether cooler heads and mounting economic pressure on both sides eventually drag negotiators back to a table before September 8th arrives, is genuinely unknowable right now. What is knowable is this. The country that spent the last 18 months quietly signing more than 20 new international trade partnerships, while absorbing real, measurable economic pain from an escalating tariff war, just demonstrated, in the most public way possible, that it was willing to walk away from a deal rather than trade away pieces of its own sovereignty to close it. That is not a small thing, and it is not going away quietly regardless of what either government says over the coming days. If this breakdown helped you understand what actually happened behind this weekend's headlines, share it with someone who thinks this is just another routine tariff dispute. Hit subscribe so you catch what happens when Canada's retaliation lands on September 8th, and drop a comment below telling me whether you think this relationship recovers before the end of the year, or whether we just watch the moment it fundamentally and permanently changed. Whatever happens over these next 2 weeks, the version of this relationship that existed even 1 week ago, one where both governments described themselves as close to a finished deal, already no longer exists, and rebuilding it will require considerably more than a revised tariff schedule. It will require both sides agreeing at some point on what actually happened this weekend, because right now, 4 days after a president posted an exclamation-pointed announcement of a completed deal, the two closest trading partners on Earth cannot even agree on that.